Hey everyone, it's Ben from Board to Bits, and welcome to part 30 of our series on making a custom character controller in Unity. So in this video we're going to be looking at how to do a different kind of in-game controller switch, this time using an item pickup. This is something akin to what we'd see in Mario, where when Mario touches a mushroom or a flower, he gets a new ability. In this case, we're going to give our walking controller character the ability to fly. So to start, let's create this actual item pickup in our scene. We're going to do this going up to Game Object, and we're going to create an empty object in our scene. I'm going to quickly reset the transform on that, and I'm going to actually move it over. Here, I'll move this scene view a little bit. I'm going to move it over to about -4 on the, not -40, -4 on the x-axis, so it's kind of next to our character on the other side from the vehicle. And we're going to rename this to Pickup. Now, childed to this, I'm going to create a 3D object, and so you can always automatically child an object by right-clicking on the parent object in the hierarchy. I'm going to create a 3D object, a cube, and this is going to be our pickup visual, but I want to be able to kind of, manipulate this, animate it, do any effects we want without actually affecting the item itself, so that's why I'm making this a child object. Now, this we need to do a few things too. First thing I want to do is I'm actually going to remove this box collider, because this isn't going to be what's responsible for controlling the interaction with the item. That's all going to be handled in the actual pickup itself. So we're going to remove that component, the box collider component. I'm going to scale this down to about 1/4 of the size on all 3 axes. And I'm going to make it hover above the world at about a y of 0.5. And lastly, I'm going to rotate it about 30 degrees on the x-axis, so it's got this little bit of a tilt to it. Now this is kind of difficult to see, as we see here in our game view, as well as our scene view. It's pretty small in that. So I'm going to actually also add a material to this. I'm going to create a new material. I'm going to call this Flight Pickup. And I'm going to make this a unlit material. So we're just going to see a solid color, and I'm going to make that color a very bright, kind of a fuchsia magenta color there. Then I can simply drag this onto the actual object itself or onto the pickup cube here in Pickup Visual. Either way will work. And we see it becomes that solid and much more visible block of color now. Last thing I want to do, because we've gotten rid of the collider in the pickup visual, I need to add a collider to this pickup itself so that we know when we're actually, when our player is touching this pickup and should be gaining the benefits of it. I'm going to actually focus in on this a little bit closer so that we can see what we're working with here. And I'm going to add a component, Sphere Collider. Now you'll notice here, it's a little bit difficult to see again just due to the white of the ground, but there is this sphere that is the Sphere Collider, but it is centered on the actual pickup where the pickup object itself is, and we want it actually to kind of center more on that cube. We can fix that easily enough here. I'm going to change its center to a y of 0.5, so it's centered at the same height as the cube itself. I'm going to change its radius to about 0.22, which makes it a little bit bigger than the sphere itself, but that way it'll handle the tilt of the sphere, as well as, but not being so big that we're going to interact with it when we didn't think we were anywhere near touching it. So with all that in place, we have our pickup pretty much ready to go. Now, in order for this to actually switch from a walking controller to a flight controller, we need to create that flight controller script, as well as the pickup script itself. So let's jump over to our scripts folder, into model scripts. I'm going to right-click and create a new C# script. This first one is going to be called flight controller. And then a second C# script, and I'm going to call this one flight pickup. Now, flight controller I'm not actually going to add to our player yet. That's going to be handled by the actual pickup object. The flight pickup, however, I can drag that onto the actual pickup object, not the visual, but that pickup itself. So now this pickup should have its transform, sphere collider that we've set, and that flight pickup script. With all that done, we can actually jump into monodevelop and start building on these things. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to open up this flight controller script. Let me zoom in a little bit here so you can see what I'm doing, and I'll maximize the thing here. So here we've got our controller script, our flight controller script. We want to make sure that this is inheriting from controller. And when we do that, we also need to make sure that we're adding in the read input method. If we open up the controller script here again, we see we have this abstract read input method, and that kind of works. If you remember our interface video where we said that interfaces kind of say, I'm promising I'm going to have this method in my class, this kind of works that same way. It's basically saying if anything inherits from controller, it needs to somehow use this read input method. So we need to make sure we're putting that in there. Fortunately, all we have to do is we can delete these two start and update methods, and we can simply add a public override void. And actually, when we just type in public override, we'll see that it kind of pre-populates with some options here. And if we go, we can click on read input, and it'll automatically fill that in for us. Now, we don't need this. We can keep this throwing an error if we want to, but I'm just going to delete it for now. It's not something we need. So I'm just going to save that like that. And that's all we need to do right now for our flight controller. We're going to get into the functionality of the controller itself in our next video. So for now, we can leave this where it is. What we do need to work with, though, is our flight pickup, because in here is where we're actually going to be telling our pickup how it should behave and how it should behave when our player interacts with it. We can get rid of the start method, and we can save that. And what we can do here, I'm going to add a quick line of text or of code into our update method, which is just going to tell our pickup to also rotate slowly a little bit, just to give it a little bit more visual interest, to make sure that our player, kind of doesn't just think it's a glitch or a item or like a prop in the world. Make sure they know that, oh, this thing is moving, I kind of want to check out what this does. So we're going to simply say transform.rotate, and it's going to take a new vector 3, which is going to be 0f on the x. For our y, we're going to say time.delta time times about 30. So it'll roughly be rotating about 30 degrees per second. And 0f on the z-axis. So it's just going to be rotating on that y-axis, so kind of spinning like a top, but very slowly. Oops. Make sure we have all our parentheses, and that is good. In addition to this, we need that way for our player to interact with this pickup, and we're going to do that using what is a void on trigger enter method. And this is going to take a collider parameter, which I'm just going to call C for brevity's sake. Now, this reminds me there is something I didn't do in Unity, so we're going to jump back there for 1 second. And when we look at our pickup, our collider here, this sphere collider, should be a trigger. And what that lets us do is say, when something kind of enters this overlapping space, we're going to trigger this event. So we need to make sure that that is checked in our object there. We'll save that quickly, and now we can jump back over to monodevelop. And so now what we're saying is when some collider enters the space of this pickup, it's going to call this method and do whatever we say inside of it, knowing that collider C is what has triggered it. So the first thing we want to do is make sure that what has entered this is the player. We don't want to be giving flight powers to random NPCs or just like a random object that happens to fall through this pickup. We want to make sure it's the player. We can do that pretty easily. We can just say if C dot, and I'm going to pull out another tool in our Unity tool bag here, which is called tags. And tags are things that all game objects have. Usually they're just kind of the default tag or an untitled tag, but they're a really convenient way that you can quickly say, hey, this object falls into this category that I'm predetermining, and therefore you can check that quickly and say, oh yes, you are the player in this case. So we can simply say if c.tag equals, and this is just checking a string against a string, so we'll say player, then we can go about doing the pickup functionality. Now, in order for this to work, we do need to make sure that our player actually has this tag. As we see right now, it defaults to being untagged, but it does come with these kind of pre-baked tags in it, respawn, finish, and then there is in fact a player tag here. You can also add your own if you have other things that you want, to clarify enemies or props or things like that. So we're going to make sure that this player is tagged as a player. And so now we're able to make sure when some collider enters this trigger, oh, are you the player? I also want to check one other thing quickly here, which is, do you already have a flight controller component? Because if this player is already able to fly, there's no need to give it another flight controller. So we'll just double check here and say if c.tag is, if it's tagged as the player, and if c.getComponent flight controller equals null, meaning we're checking, does this have a flight controller on it? And if that comes back as null, meaning there are no flight controllers, then we know, okay, this is the player. They don't have the ability to fly. Let's give them the ability to fly. How we're going to give them that ability is we're actually going to add that component to the player. We know they don't have one. They don't have a flight controller component. We will add one. We can simply do that by saying c.gameObject.addComponent, and we're going to add the flight controller component. And what this does now is says when you enter this, you get that component added. In fact, we can take a look at that right now. So we see our player here. We've got a walking controller, rigid body, mesh renderer, etc. If we hit play, what I should be able to do, we do see the rotation is happening too. That's cool. And now if I walk over to the left here and collide with that, we see that that flight controller appears. Now we notice there's also this issue that there are suddenly now no cameras rendering and a few other weird things going on there, so we need to double check what all that is about. But for now, we know that we are successfully adding that component. So in addition to adding this component, we do want to make sure that our flight controller becomes the active controller for the input manager to speak to. So we need to be able to say, hey, that flight controller that you just got, activate it. The easiest way for us to do this is if we look at the flight controller tooltip here, we see that it returns the flight controller component that we just added. So what we can say, we can create a quick variable for storage here, and we can say flight controller fc equals c.gameObject.addComponent flight controller. So it's kind of doing double duty. Not only is this adding the flight controller to our player, it's also storing it here now. And so now what we can say is that that fc should activate itself. So we'll hit save there. And last thing I want to do is inside of here is I want to say, once we've gotten this object, this pickup, it should probably disappear from the scene. We can do this a couple ways. We could destroy the game object altogether. I'm actually going to just set its active game object to false. So we'll say gameObject.setActive false, so that we could, in theory, respawn this after a couple of minutes or after the player loses flight ability, something like that. But that will just kind of get rid of it. It'll also make sure that we're not, colliding with it multiple times and sending off trigger events more than we need to. So with all of that done, go back here and we can see that if I hit play and I walk over to this, we are adding that flight controller, and if we go over to input manager, we see that that's now the controller is the player's flight controller component. So that is working, but for some reason we keep on getting this thing now saying display no cameras rendering, which is weird because we have a camera on our player, we have our player, it has the active controller on it, yet for some reason if we go to our scene view, we see that our player is vanishing. And in fact, if we look at our hierarchy, we see that our player is completely inactive here. The player's game object is inactive, which means that all of its children are being deactivated as well. The reason for this is, if you recall, when we created the vehicle, we wanted our player to vanish when they were no longer the active controller, so it didn't look like we were cloning the player both standing outside the vehicle and inside the vehicle, which worked great for that at that time. But now we're dealing with kind of a different system where we've got a controller that's switching, but the player avatar should remain. And so we need to look at our controller and see why we were telling it to deactivate itself. So if we jump back over to our controller and to our activate method, we see here that what we said was, when we deactivated it, it was if you should no longer be present once you're deactivated, then set your game object to false. And that still makes sense. We do want that to happen. If we go over to the vehicle, we want the player to vanish. However, when we activate again, we're only making sure that the game object is active if it has that present when inactive bool set, if we're activating that particular switch in this controller's setup. Really what we should say is whenever you're activating a controller, the relevant game object we should make sure that it's active. So regardless of whether you're the vehicle or the player, and you're the player with the walking controller or the flight controller, we want to make sure if you're the active controller in the scene, you should be visible. So what we're just going to do here is we're going to get rid of this if check. And we're just going to make sure no matter what happens, we are making sure that this game object is set to active. So that we're never going to be in this situation where we have a character whose controller is active, but then for some reason their game object isn't. So with that done, we can now be sure that once we activate our flight controller, we're still in the world. So let's hit play one more time here. And we're walking around. If we look at our input manager, we see that we're currently set to the walking controller, but we can walk around, and then once we collide again with this pickup, that switches to the flight controller. Now you will notice I'm still pressing controls and nothing is happening. That's because our read input method for the flight controller doesn't have anything in it. So that's what we're going to fix in our next video, which is that we're going to actually implement the functionality of our flight controller so that we're able to move not just horizontally but vertically and ignore gravity and fly wherever we want in our scene. So that'll be our next video. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.